Dear colleagues, greetings from Brno in Czechia. My paper Protecting Life, the Common Goals of Nature Reserves and Architectural Heritage Sites addresses the protection of sites through the idea of preserving the environment as a functional whole. Within this broad framework, it focuses on the meaning of so-called conservation areas. Protected natural areas have their parallel in protected sets of buildings, and the English expression conservation area is used for both. The first part of the paper looks back to the beginnings of the holistic understanding of conservation. The second part sums up the present situation, while the third part argues for an integrated conception of environment, which comes out of interdisciplinary research in complex adaptive systems. When observing so-called indigenous peoples, we tend to feel nostalgia for their modest lifestyle and intense interconnection with their environment. It is as if the civilization with all its disastrous effects was an epidemic that comes from elsewhere. Yet, is this view correct? Most of pre-industrial societies were less destructive, not because of their generally better attitude to the world, but because they were smaller and less technologically advanced. It's necessary to emphasize that the pre-industrial changes in both natural and cultural landscapes were not structural. The changed environment didn't strikingly differ from what people were used to. Rome, rebuilt in the Baroque style, structurally resembled medieval and classical Rome. Similarly, the cultivated country landscape didn't look fundamentally different than the uncultivated landscape. This important fact will be further discussed. The situation changed with the Industrial Revolution. It was at this point that enlightened individuals began to realize that certain kinds of environments were as endangered as the individual artifacts, and that this danger was not locally isolated. This fact led to counteractions. Some examples from Central Europe deserve our attention. In the conservation of historic urban landscapes, Nuremberg, Germany, was a model example. The Bavarian king Ludwig I decided to save it from modernization, aiming not to only protect the architectural style, but also to preserve memories of the city's great cultural past. Later on, initiators of so-called homeland protection realized that industrialization, population upsurgist and progressivist ideologies of all kinds endangered not only old cities and wilderness, but also the traditional cultural landscape and what is nowadays referred to as intangible heritage. They managed to activate the masses and transform conservationism into a truly democratic movement with a significant political influence and pioneering agenda grounded in a holistic and ecological approach. The Viennese art historian Alois Riegel produced what was likely the first philosophical analysis of values fundamental to the relationship to heritage monuments and decisions about what to do with them. What about the situation today? The conservation movement has succeeded in designating approximately 13% of land and less than 3% of oceans as conservation areas. These include largely nature reserves. Architectural heritage sites take up a fragment of the overall expanse of cities that surround them. All French historical centers within the city walls fill 3.7% of urban areas and less than 10% if 19th century development is included. The numbers do not reveal much on their own. It's far more important to compare the environment inside and outside the reserves. At the turn of the 20th century, all cities were sometimes perceived in a similar way as wild nature. From today's perspective, however, the differences between the preserved localities and those rebuilt around the turn of the 20th century are minimal. A common visitor to Old Prague usually fails to see difference between Baroque streets and those built in the Art Nouveau style. Outside Europe, the differences were also largely negligible. The new development's architectural language resembled the old development, and there was enough space for wildlife outside the cities. For example, in the year 1900, when the planet was home to 1.6 billion people, Africa housed 120 million people and 10 million elephants. The present situation is very different. There is 7.8 billion people on Earth, of which 1.3 billion, 11 times more than the previous number, live in Africa. The number of elephants has plummeted to 350,000. The numbers concerning heritage monuments are equally weighty. In the 20th century, Amsterdam lost 1/4 of its historical buildings, Rome 1/3, Cairo 1/2, and Beijing most of its traditional developments. Nobody has ever tried to count all the existing buildings according to types and create charts capturing their decline or increase, but it's likely that the numbers would correspond with the charts showing changes in the population of elephants. The differences between the preserved localities and those rebuilt around the turn of the 21st century are striking. Conservation areas are too small and scattered to stop the advancing biodiversity loss. On the other hand, it's precisely this laboratory-like character of conservation areas in contrast to their monotonous surroundings that helps us emphasize the structural features shared by nature and heritage monuments. Are we able to understand these features? The drastic decline of the traditional environment during the 20th century compelled researchers, theorists, to ask again, what states and actions characterize this environment and what does it mean for us? Their research was based on 3 interconnected pillars: mathematics, ecology, and aesthetics. In the 1970s and 1980s, mathematician Benoît Mandelbrot described the geometrical structure of natural shapes using fractals, objects featuring qualities such as hierarchy of scales and self-similarity. Mandelbrot argued that the quotation, a Mies van der Rohe building is a scale-bound throwback to Euclid, while a high period Beaux-Arts building is rich in fractal aspects. In the same period, biologist Edward Wilson focused on human kinship with other living forms called biophilia, a relationship he considered evolutionary, enriching, and necessary for our species. Mathematician and architect Christopher Alexander analyzed buildings and other artifacts across time and cultures and revealed parallels that confirm the hypothesis that the universe is an organized system whose order, we are only beginning to understand, even though we can perceive it, reproduce it, and appreciate it. These pioneering studies gave birth to the research which now involves a growing number of researchers from all over the world. Aside from mathematicians, biologists, and designers, they include physicists, psychologists, environmentalists, physicians, and art historians. They describe the traditional built environment as a living system with qualities inherent to biological structures such as organized complexity, adaptation, or connectivity. We can observe these qualities in systems where the degree of complexity is proportional to the system's health. For example, a forest and an old town can both be considered rich, complex, and healthy living systems, while environments such as plantations or typical modern suburbs are monofunctional, insufficiently elastic, isolated from their environs, and designed with no regard to long-term sustainability, that is, dying. Does the conservation movement follow any of the outcomes described here? In most cases, not directly. Nevertheless, we may roughly distinguish four, often converging routes. First, many international charters and recommendations adopted by ICOMOS, UNESCO, and the European Union, emphasizing the place-making features of heritage. Second, open-air museums that mimic tangible and intangible features of pre-industrial settlements. Third, the traditionalist architectural movement where conservation matters are an integral part of education curricula and the design agenda. Fourth, the methodology of heritage value assessment where the criteria may suggest an emerging unified view of the world as an infinitely complex whole. Broadly speaking, the conservation movement has gradually upgraded its mission from protecting selected biological and cultural forms to protecting life on Earth in general. Conservation areas have become focal points of life, centers, as Christopher Alexander calls them, attracting millions of tourists who go there to find connection with the world from which they are cut off in their everyday lives. Feeling more alive, they photograph these places and share the pictures with their friends. Considering current demographic trends, it's difficult to formulate a realistic strategy for conservationist politics that would stop the ongoing depletion of the diversity on Earth. However, it doesn't mean conservationists should give up. On the contrary, the convergence between the protection of nature and heritage in the name of a common goal, the protection of life, gives the conservationist movement an extraordinary ethical charge and, I believe, the energy it needs to face our current challenges. These challenges include not only preserving heritage, but also understanding the web of relationships between its components. We must understand the forces that ensure vitality in pre-industrial environments when these forces are still perceptible in protected areas, conservation areas. Such understanding is necessary not only for keeping the existing reserves safe and sound, but also for reconstructing life in devastated areas in case the opportunity arises in the future. Good architecture will be a part of this process. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention.